Welcome to It's Our Money with Ellen Brown, a look behind the curtain of global finance and monetary control with one of the foremost experts in the field. Author of the bestseller Web of Debt and the Public Bank Solution, Ellen Brown's groundbreaking work began the movement to create new American public banks. We'll look at issues surrounding the world of money and the systems and powers that control it, as well as the progress being made on the public banking frontier. The program is underwritten by Public Banking Associates, a national consultancy of experts advising government leaders pursuing creation of their own public banks at publicbankingassociates.com. Another historic milestone in the emergence of public banks around the country has been reached in Philadelphia with an overwhelming vote by the City Council to establish a municipal public financial authority. Hello, and welcome to It's Our Money with Ellen Brown. I'm Walt McCree, Ellen's co-host and senior advisor to the Public Banking Institute. On today's program, we're going to be talking with two of the prime movers in the Philadelphia success, Vanessa Lowe and Conni, Bille, who will tell us about what this new municipal institution is meant to accomplish and how they pulled it off as a citizen action. It's an encouraging and creative tale about citizens using their democratic power to support a multi-year effort to create a public bank in one of America's greatest cities. Later on in the program, Ellen will be talking with author Michael Mechanic, whose new book called Jackpot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. So let's get started with our discussion on Philadelphia's breakthrough success at creating a public bank for the city of Philadelphia. Today, in this part of the program, we're going to talk about a recent victory for people who love public banking, and that's us, of course, in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, as you may know, was the place in which the Quakers started the first public bank in America about 200 years ago. Actually, it's 300 years ago almost, and it was the public bank, the Quaker Bank model in Philadelphia, that created an enormously potent economic viability and sustainability and investment, people moving the money around for common purpose, common good. And of course, that helped to build the American colonies until Ben Franklin spilled the beans to King George and said, hey, we got our own money over here. And King George said, hey, no, you don't. That's off the table now. So that's kind of a very brief and somewhat sarcastic history of public banking in America. But Philadelphia passed by a vote of 15-1 the approval of creating a Philadelphia Public Financing Authority, which is a forerunner to actually creating a public bank. We're very excited about that because Philadelphia is the poorest major city in America. Even though it's got fabulous wealth, it has chronic poverty as part of it. And a couple of the people I'll introduce you to right now have been very principled, very centrally involved in making this happen, creating the Philadelphia Public Bank Initiative. One is Vanessa Lowe. Vanessa is chairman of the Economic Development Group of the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition. And if I have this right, Vanessa, you're also the co-founder of the Power organization.
I'm the co-chair of the Economic Dignity Team for Power, which is Pennsylvania's Organizing to Witness, Empower, and Rebuild. We're a community organizing network that operates through faith-based institutions. And my role in this, I sort of came in late. I did go to that 2014 banking conference, but I got brought back into this process to be the moderator / host of Financing Philadelphia's Future, which was essentially a show that we started to keep the conversation going.
Helping that also is Conni Bille. Conni was actually the co-founder of the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition going back about 6 or 7 years, and also is on the steering committee of Neighborhood Networks, yet another community group that helped to pull together a very street level grassroots demand to create a public bank. So let's talk about why Philadelphia chose this route, and what is it that makes you excited about the prospect of having a bank? Vanessa, let's hear your take on how banking is situated in Philadelphia and what the needs are.
Yeah, so it's interesting because my professional life, I spent 21 years in federal service working on access to capital for underserved communities. So that included about 7 years with the CDFI fund, the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, which certifies and invests in financial institutions to serve the underserved. And in fact, Philadelphia is quite the, what we'll call it, a hotbed for CDFIs. And at the same time, the fact is that even CDFIs are not going as deeply into the community as they can. And particularly with Black and Brown entrepreneurs. There are many systemic and essentially kind of how our economy is set up, ways that the economy was structured to exclude us, to exclude African Americans and other people of color. So I am excited, and Derek Green is certainly excited and often talks about how one of the main reasons we need our own public bank is so that we can partner with those CDFIs and other institutions that are dedicated to serving the underserved, so they can go even deeper into the community and deeper into addressing the barriers that certain people face in getting access to credit.
Derek Green is the champion council member who really has been driving this bill, this ordinance forward. Ellen?
Could you elaborate on what barriers to getting credit, small and medium size, or particularly?
Yeah, so, and it's interesting because he likes to talk about, and I don't want to speak for him, but I know that he came from the banking sector. And the major thing that happened with the banking sector was essentially credit scoring, right? So it took this relationships that people would have with their banks, particularly entrepreneurs, like sort of think back to Main Street, right? They'd go to the banker and they knew the banker knew them. But then when essentially using a digitized system of making a decision without any real conversation with that person who's asking for the loan, most of the banks lost that relationship and connection to the community. So that was a big piece. But, even aside from that, it's always been hard for Black folks to get access to capital, right? Just after, slavery was abolished, a bank was set up, right? I mean, I don't know the whole story there, but I know enough from the little bit of, sort of training I've had that a bank was set up for the African American community. And they started saving in that bank because, they were farmers. They were also craftspeople, right? They could shoe horses and things. They had skills because, those skills were being given away to the slave owners. And but then essentially the government, sort of stole that bank, and the white folks stole that bank. So ongoing and systemic racism and government policies that support lacking access to capital are some of the things that still exist.
Let's bring
the GI Bill and
right.
All of that money that was given to the soldiers who came home. But the fact is, and it wasn't necessarily written in the legislation, now that I, as I recently learned, that it couldn't go to African Americans, but because of the systems of how, real estate worked and the developers and the bias that already existed in home ownership, Black folks were not getting access to those loans. And so that's what, essentially created redlining. Yeah. And as we're being reminded every day now with what's going on, home ownership is it's an amazing source of wealth in this country. Yeah. And, it's being lost at an astronomical rate for African Americans. So I'll leave it there.
Just addressing the very critical thing which you talked about, the change from evaluating people and their credit worthiness by their role and their character in the community. We went to this digitized system, which advantages people who already have assets. So it's shifted immediately to people who already own homes, already own slaves, already owned all of the things that create wealth. And that just accelerated. And that is something that is much more recent because I think all the bankers like Derek lived through that switch from community-based banks to this kind of impersonal credit system. And I was having a home inspection done myself. And so I can tell you now it's all about this paperwork stuff. Nobody met me personally or wants to know anything about me. And I have going to different creditors, I have a bone to pick with one of them because of the way they dealt with, some credit things. So it's a different world, and it's disadvantaged to people of color and people without means already.
A disempowering financial system in many cases. Describe to us what the strategy is on the Philadelphia Public Financing Authority and why you're talking about an authority instead of a bank.
One of the roadblocks that we recognized in the coalition very early on was the important thing in getting a bank established is legal. So what is the legal framework under which we can establish one in the state of Pennsylvania? And we wanted, first as the state level, but then we were looking at municipal. Under our home rule charter, can we establish a bank? But there was this little provision in the state law that said that only the state can call something a bank, a depository bank. And because of that, it was a little bit of a stymie. No one knew if we could people wrote white papers. But then for years of chatting it up and going around and connecting with some high-powered banking experts, one came forward and kind of volunteered and said, we think there's a way around this. So we put them into contact, basically. So, well, hey, the city needs legal expertise. And basically, the legal advisors came up with the strategy that you can form an authority, and the authority can actually form a bank. The capitalization would not be the same as, say, in North Dakota, where it's using the full faith and credit, like all the deposits of the government entity. Instead, the capitalization can be gathered different ways, partly from the government. So that's the next step, is the capitalization. But it can be done and it can belong to the city. So that was, I would say, from legally, the critical breakthrough for the authority, and the reason why there's an authority and not a bank initially.
And it's a step that's being taken elsewhere around the country to have this interim organizational facility to use the time that it takes to get a bank charter and to navigate that territory, which is regulatory hurdles, as financial hurdles, staffing challenges, and so forth. All of that takes a lot of time. And of course, as our politics goes through election cycles, the champions that we rely on to bring these policy changes forward can lose their jobs, in which case the project itself can stop. So these are really very creative. And I think Philadelphia has done really one of the most creative solutions to get this thing going that way. So what is the status of it right now? What's happening next with the Philadelphia effort?
Well, the next step will be the capitalization. The annual budget for the city, we're on a fiscal year that starts July 1st. So beginning in a couple of weeks, the mayor will be presenting his budget to city council. And then there's a debate back and forth and public hearings about the budget. And of course, the coalition and our allies will be pushing for the budget to include some monies as seed money for the public bank. Probably won't be all the money. There can be other venues such as issuing bonds. But I think that's the next step. It's going to be how much could we get from city to start it? I think that's the next challenge. What do you think, Vanessa?
The other thing, and we're going to start this pretty soon, is really working on finding the leaders of the bank. Legislation calls for two different bodies. The first is a 9-member board of directors, and those folks are named by the mayor. But that board, like the next group I'll talk about, they have to be nominated by community organizations within the city of Philadelphia. So it's really important in any public banking is the idea is we want the citizens of the city to really have a voice in this. So that's one of the most important things I think we're going through now is identifying who the leaders are. So those 9 members of the board of directors appointed by the mayor, then they appoint a 9-member policy board. And it is the policy board who will finalize what are the product offerings? You know, are we going to do, you know, who are we going to partner with? Because while they may be, you know, some people are saying, oh, so we're going to do direct loans. We're not necessarily going to do direct loans to entrepreneurs because, again, we have a wide and vast network of dedicated lenders who are really committed to that. But we may find ways of providing them with letters of credit and other ways for them to go deeper and better into the community to serve folks who are not already being served. So that policy board will decide on what they'll do. I always like to raise at this point the issue of the North Dakota Bank, that they have a student loan program. You know, that I would love us to see us do that at some point, not anywhere near because we've got so many hurdles to get through. But, you know, we can be so imaginative now about how we can use our own money as opposed to sending it to Wall Street. And that's the other thing I wanted to bring up is I am so excited about our eventual opportunity to not have to send our money outside of our city to Wall Street, have it, you know, operating in predatory and ways that are really contrary to, you know, what happens in Philadelphia and what should happen in Philadelphia in order for us to be a thriving city.
Yeah, that's a theme that is employed or drawn on by the people in Los Angeles and San Francisco and elsewhere around the country, where the global banks that accept the deposits from the tax money that people pay put that into things that people don't really want: private prisons, payday lenders, fossil fuels. I mean, a whole list of actions and investments that Wall Street, you know, makes its big money on. You know, when this project in Philadelphia started about 10 years ago, Mike Krause, who was at the time just one of the founding members of Public Banking Institute, as Ellen can tell us. Yeah. Put this forward, and when he was talking, we would go around and visit a variety of people and sources in Philadelphia, and he would address the question of corruption, because people would say, you know, especially in Philadelphia, but Philadelphia, you could say it's Chicago, you could say any city USA. He would like to say people would be in disbelief. What? You're going to give the politicians a bank? What are you, crazy? You know, that's sort of and so how is that going to be addressed? How is the Philadelphia public financing? Go ahead, Connie.
Well, for one thing, there was a very kind of heated argument aimed at opposing the bank on that very basis, just the day before the legislation was introduced. And we replied in a rather heated way saying, oh, so we're more corrupt than, say, Wells Fargo, who, you know, actually was fraudulent, or that created the whole collapse of the economy in 2009, you know, along with their fellow other banks in Wall Street, by kind of seducing the city into credit default swaps. Yeah, that they knew that they were advantaged by. I said, oh, so you would trust them more than, you know,
your elected politicians that
democratically elected, who we can fire. You know, we have the control over who we hire and fire as a mayor, and we don't like their choices. There's the neighborhood network side of it. That's what Neighborhood Networks works on. So that's one of the main arguments. But the other argument that speaks to people and was very effective in talking to community groups, which we did go around and we talked to small groups all over the city, and many op-eds were written by members of our coalition. And we talked about, well, what's our experience with banks in the last, say, 20, 30 years. There used to be something called the Germantown Savings Bank, which had been around for hundreds of years. Right. And then suddenly it started changing its name. And within a few years, it became Core States, and then it became Wachovia, and then it became First something or other, and then Union. It became, and now it's Wells Fargo. Yeah. Wachovia. And at the same time, down the block, the payday lender and the check cashing places opened up because people couldn't afford bank accounts anymore because of the fees. and the difficulty.
Yeah.
So that meant something to people because it was their lived experience. So that was one way we also carried that message to people.
I wanted to ask Vanessa, you said that all the CDFIs you have, but apparently they want to work with a public bank, or what is it that they need that the public bank can do for them?
Well, so it's interesting. During one of our Finance in Philadelphia shows, we had the executive director, Jim Burnett, who's actually an old mentor of mine, who runs a CDFI out in West Philadelphia. And now CDFIs have been around for more than 25, I think we're getting to 30 years. So in the beginning, they were seen as very much like, what do you mean you're going to lend to people who are poor, or, lend to people who can't get access to credit from other banks? Because there's a reason for that, right? So there was lots of suspicion and just sort of feeling like this is never going to work. Well, now it's survived for 30 years, and they got an allocation of $3 billion under the Recovery Act. Why? Because they were the institutions that were successful at getting those PPP, remember the Payroll Protection Program loans, just as COVID was hitting, into the hands of the small entrepreneurs, which is who it was supposed to go to. It wasn't supposed to go to Shake Shack. So all over the country, there were headlines about how these CDFIs were just doing a great job at truly getting that money to where it was needed to save small businesses, not the big ones. So anyway, that is long established, right? And so the ones that need funds are the ones that are very small, because despite the fact that the government said, here, this industry now gets $3 billion, the small ones, the way that money gets allocated is based on their amount of lending recently, so the prior year. So what he said during our show, this executive director of the CDFI said, there's just so much they would give me because we were already a small lender. So like we were just talking about, it's like, okay, you're defining this in a way that is already limiting, right? So that's definitely one of the big issues, particularly with Black-led CDFIs, because they tend to be the smallest. Again, it's sort of a circular thing of, the more you limit us, the more our institutions are limited and the more our growth is limited. So that's one of the big things.
So CDFI, for those of you, we said it before, but it's Community Development Financial Institution. And they're not banks, but they are managers and distributors of credit, as Vanessa said, but they aren't really banks in the sense that they don't leverage their capital in the same way. Go ahead, Vanessa. So
just to clarify, and it's a really good question. It's an interesting distinction. So let me go to the CDFI fund. That's the sort of biggest provider of funding for CDFIs.
A federal level.
Division of U.S. Treasury. So it's a division of the federal government Treasury Department. Yeah. I worked there for about 7 years. So the predominance of the about 1,100 institutions that have been certified as CDFIs, because they need to pass all this criteria. Are you a lending institution? The biggest thing is, are you dedicated to serving the underserved? So there's about 1,100 institutions now. And the predominance of those institutions are what we call loan funds. Those are non-depository, non-regulated institutions. And a lot of them are like focused on affordable housing development, for example, right? Mm-hmm. So they're not banks, but there can be, so the next biggest tranche is credit unions, actually. Right. So they are depositories. They are insured by the federal government. And then very small number of traditional banks, BANKS, actually are certified as CDFIs, but that's one of the smallest groups. So most of them are non-regulated, non-depository loan funds. And that's why that infusion of capital is so important, because it's not like they take deposits. A traditional bank and the credit unions, they lend based on their deposits. But these non-regulated, non-depository institutions, they've depended on essentially the first folks who were lending to them. It was the nuns, the sisters.
Oh, yeah, interesting.
They were putting their retirement funds on the line because they were dedicated to the mission.
Wow.
Oh, that's interesting. That's how it was in Europe, going way back.
There you go. It's always the faith-based faith-based folks move first, right?
There you go.
Right.
And I was going to say that the Black and Brown communities in Philadelphia, the dominant financial institution are credit unions in churches. And there are
Yes.
quite a number of those.
There are, and they're very small.
Very small.
And so very often what they end up being is sort of savings clubs.
Yeah.
Because now, I mean, that's it. Credit unions, they are a regulated institutions, and they're sort of subject to, the rules, essentially the rules and regulations of any other, banking type institution. So a lot of them that are still surviving, essentially it's a small membership. And so they're managing the church's funds and things like that. The ones that are surviving for the long term, a lot of those have merged into, say, some of the largest, credit unions, Philadelphia Federal, Fire, that kind of thing. And so they may not have necessarily a branch in the church any longer. But I'm glad you brought that up, Walt, because that's the thing. Black folks have always had to find another way to finance their things, right? Because the original bank, after we, came out of slavery, didn't work. And so, whether it's, what do they call them? Susu clubs. Okay, well, we'll all save our funds together and start sharing. Then that turned into, credit unions and other ways. So yeah, we've always sort of had to kind of bootstrap and do it among ourselves, and we've done it. And so now it's really time to look at what in the traditional economy was set up purposefully to exclude us and fix it.
Yeah. Very, very interesting and timely, because democracy is, of course, very much front and center on the headlines of the world, certainly, domestically and internationally. And as we'd like to say in the public banking world, that we are democratizing our money, bringing it back into the hands of the people. And here, I think we've seen this beautiful example of the people standing together to do that very thing. To reclaim control of their money and to put it where it matters to them, which is into the community.
Yeah, and I think I just wanted, and I really want that to be the carrying cry almost, because part of that system that was set up on purpose was pretending like there were these special people who needed these very fancy degrees because they know more about how the money should be managed. So therefore we need to send it to this place called Wall Street, where, these predominantly behind computers, and they know how to make it work. Well, we know how they made it work, right? 2007, 2008, essentially by creating, these fake products, putting so many people at risk. And what I like to bring up is an interest-only loan to get a mortgage where essentially you're never paying down the balance. Right. So you're actually saying to these people who you perceive, and sometimes they were, sort of challenged with credit. Okay, so essentially you're going to carry this debt for the rest of your life and you're going to pass it on to their kids. And they did not care. That is just predatory, that is evil. And that's what we need to stop. Yeah. So pretending like, by sending it to these special people who sit up on Wall Street, that somehow that's protecting our money, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Well, this has been very nice. Really good to have a briefing from you folks about what's going on in Philly. Conni, is there anything I would like to add before we have to move on?
I guess what is most unique and that we're particularly proud of is what Vanessa mentioned earlier, which is that, the boards of the bank will be made up of community organization, people heavily involved in community organizations, and they will be from environmental groups, public health, public education, cooperatives, small business development people, gender justice people, public transportation. It is spelled out where this tremendous civic resource of civic devotion, let's put it that way, beautiful, will be involved in the bank. So it's not just, we just want, smart banker types who know how to turn a buck. No, we want people who know how to develop a community. And
that's great.
They're not developing it for their bonuses. They're developing it for their community.
That's
Well said.
yeah, well said. And I think we'll have to leave it there. But I want to thank you so much for sharing that. We, of course, are going to be following this historic development and the historic steps that you take next in Philadelphia to lead the country again toward a new democratic prospect for public interest and protection of our communities and each other. Conni Bille, Vanessa Lowe, Ellen Brown, thank you very much for this conversation. Take care.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure.
It's my pleasure to be speaking with Michael Mechanic, a longtime senior editor at Mother Jones Magazine and former managing editor of the East Bay Express, which is based in Oakland, California. He is the author of Jackpot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. He has also written many articles and has won numerous awards as a journalist. His website is readjackpot.com. So, Michael, it's great to be speaking with you.
Great to be here.
So you're an excellent writer and you tell a very good tale. And it's sort of, comforting to all the rest of us to hear that it's being rich and being among the uber rich is not what everything is cracked up to be. You call it money is a blessing and a curse, a cage with gilded bars. So I wonder if first you could just kind of give us a little summary of your book and what prompted you to write it and sort of what message you want to get across.
Well, my story is really kind of an exploration of the American wealth fantasy and to sort of distinguish the fantasy of wealth from the reality of wealth. Like what's it really like to be really, really rich? But not only that, I was interested in sort of how our attitudes towards wealth and our sort of hoarding instincts have contributed to the problems that we face in our society, especially in sort of the stretching apart of the ladders of opportunity, such that it's very hard to move up and down, or to move up. And this is sort of our national aspiration, is sort of to kind of move up the ladder. We have this sort of idea of social mobility in this country, and it's sort of part of our ethos that we can work hard and apply ourselves and get to some more secure place. But very often what we're doing is we're sort of fetishizing these rags to riches stories, which are in fact very rare. And we have what researchers call mobility optimism. It is actually unfounded, but we tell ourselves these stories and it allows us to sort of tolerate what really is mind-blowing inequality of wealth in this country.
I think what you said about this tendency to hoard, you never feel secure, really, no
Right.
matter how rich you are. You might have live in a mansion, but you've got a mortgage on your mansion. And so you don't know for sure. I saw an article of people that didn't have $500 to spare in an emergency. I'm sure you've seen. But some of them were actually rich and didn't have 500 because their commitments were bigger than their actual assets. So
the real estate people, they're always major debt. That's how they run. Everything is
Right.
leveraged. But those guys, you own a bunch of buildings and then you borrow against those, and basically these guys don't pay income tax because they take out loans against their properties, and that's their income. And sometimes they can take basically a tax break on their income rather than paying taxes on it. Kind of astounding.
First, I wonder if you could just tell us some of your favorite stories of why it's not everything it's cracked up to be wealthy.
Well, we think that wealth is going to kind of solve all our problems. And at a base level, if you are poor, if you can't make ends meet, if you're in debt, if you're struggling, paycheck to paycheck, of course, having more money is going to help you and make you happier. But there's a sort of very surprisingly low limit to that. Like researchers have done surveys with millions and millions of people across countries, and they find that the level of income where people are sort of satisfied with their lives, it sort of peaks between like $65,000 and $100,000 a year in earnings. And after that, they call it the satiation point. And after that, your sort of self-reported happiness doesn't increase. In fact, it often decreases, because in order to maintain that lifestyle, you're working much harder, you're spending a lot more time, you're spending a lot more mental energy on your investments, and where does this go? What is that, managing properties and all this stuff. And it ends up being kind of an albatross on your shoulder. Like the money's whispering to you all day long. I actually recently read in the Washington Post a profile of Leon Cooperman, the hedge funder. It's worth billions of dollars. And he's, I think he's in his 80s now. He didn't understand why people don't like rich people. These guys, I'll say, it's not the player, it's the game, right? The game is bad. The players are, everyone likes to consider themselves a good person, right? People that we think of as the villainous rich, they don't think they're villainous. They rationalize their behavior. They say, I'm not doing anything illegal.
And it does make me think of one story you told of a man who
Zal Kravitsky, yeah,
who gave away everything and still wasn't, it's almost like you have this guilt, or some rich people need to assuage their reputations by giving it away. And so he had given away his money and he still wasn't really satisfied. So he gave away a kidney, which to a stranger, I mean,
stranger.
Many people do, or not many, but people do give kidneys to a relative or somebody, a loved one. And you can certainly understand that if they're, your loved one's going to die, but to give it to a stranger, it's a hard thing to grasp.
People thought he was crazy, and he said, I wasn't crazy. I mean, he said, I've never been happier.
Yeah.
I mean, he almost sort of became addicted to giving away his money. He sort of started doing it and then wanted to do more of it. He's an odd case, though. Most people of his level of wealth give away just a tiny fraction of their money and use that to sort of assuage their feelings of guilt, if they have feelings of guilt, or to, in some cases,
build their reputation,
burnish their reputations. Or, and often the philanthropic giving is tied up with, tax planning. And you think about people with foundations and donor advised funds. Well, these foundations, they're almost unregulated. And the law only requires that a foundation, a charitable foundation, give away 5% of its assets each year. And that can include the overhead of the company. So if you take the board of directors on a junket to Ibiza and some resort and have a board meeting there for 2 weeks, that all comes out of the 5% that you're supposed to be giving away. And meanwhile, this 5% payout, well, the stock market could be going up 20% that year, and you're pulling in far more money than you're giving out. And yet there's no requirement that you shell out this money. And this is money that people have already taken a tax deduction on. So essentially, the taxpayers are subsidizing these foundations kind of in a big way. The more money they have sitting around, the more they're being subsidized by taxpayers. It's even worse for what's called the donor advised funds, where a billionaire can just sort of park a huge amount of money. And these funds, they're meant to be for charitable use, but there's no payout requirement whatsoever. So they can just sort of put that money aside and let it sit there. And the problem with that is, again, that depending on their tax rate, the public is subsidizing that money. It's basically public expenditure sitting locked up. And it's sitting locked up, and it's going to be used for whatever that billionaire wants to do with it. And that may or may not be in the public interest. So, I mean, philanthropy has a real role to play in filling gaps that the government can't or won't fill, but it's no replacement for government. And I've talked to wealthy people. This is a common argument. They say, well, the government is a lousy charity, like they're inefficient, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, that's not the role of government. The government isn't to be a charity. The role of government is to, keep things running smoothly and have laws that benefit all of us and help people who really need help and lift them up. The government has a role, and there's a very anti-government streak running through the ultra wealthy crowd in this country, actually all over the world. They think the government is a game to be played, and they do game it in a big way.
Well, I think that is the major problem with our political system, is that both political parties, in order to get in office and stay in office, you have to get money, attract big money. And I don't know how we fix that. I mean, we do have this sense that the justification for capitalism is that it's a level playing field and it's a land of equal opportunity. It's something we we pride ourselves in being, but it's obviously not. I mean, clearly the opportunities aren't equal. Many people work very hard all their lives and barely make ends meet. So either you have to, like you say, hit the jackpot, meaning you inherit it or whatever, you win the lottery or something like that, or just get a lucky break. Even if you make it on your own, and you still probably need a lucky break here or there, or people do get lucky breaks, so you hear.
Yeah, so we tend to play, it's sort of human nature to play down the luck and play up our role in the achievement. I mean, there's one chapter in the book where I sit down with a psychology researcher named Paul Piff, who studies the psychology of wealth and how our behavior and values are correlated with our relative wealth. And he did a famous experiment in which he set up rigged games of the game Monopoly. And so one player would have twice as much money and roll the dice, pass go more often because they roll the dice, 2 dice instead of 1, and get twice as much money when they pass go. So there's sort of an alternative set of rules he made. And then there would be a coin toss, and these volunteers who had come to do the experiment, one person would be the rich player and one would be the poor player. And they would play for 15 minutes and they would stop the game and talk to them. And so what happened is the rich players started acting more aggressive, making sort of snarky comments to the other person, actually physically expanding themselves so they took up more space. I mean, there were just these interesting little behavioral effects. The thing that the most interested Piff is that when they sort of debrief them afterwards, the rich players would justify by talking about their strategy and their smart strategy in the game, as opposed to saying, "Oh yeah, it was rigged the whole time, right? I flipped the coin. I was just lucky. I got the good side, right?" They really played that down. They played up their role in the win. I mean, and that's just something that we do. We think of ourselves as deserving of our success, and as a corollary, we see people who are unsuccessful as undeserving. That's why people are derided as being lazy and unmotivated. And if you look at polling, we still have these attitudes. They didn't succeed because they didn't work hard enough. But that's, as one wealthy source told me, he said, work is necessary, hard work is necessary, but it's not sufficient. You need hard work, you need luck, timing, people supporting you. But then there are people who make a lot of money and they think they did it all on their own. And you get you have this big libertarian streak in Silicon Valley, for instance. People say, we don't want it, you can't come and regulate. We built this. And it's like, well, actually, the government built the internet. The government built the roads that you drive to work on. I mean, it sort of blows me away. People forget how much they owe the commons.
Yeah, that's where we're coming from too. And it seems to me we do need a social safety net of some sort. I mean, at least basic security. Everybody wants security. No matter how rich you are, you could feel insecure in our current civilization. And even just economically, we can't compete with other countries that do give a safety net for, they give free medical or free education all the way through college, subsidized transportation, that sort of thing. And so our employers have to pay enough wages to cover all those things. And so we can't compete with the Chinese or whatever. So we do need some sort of safety net. But beyond that.
Well, the thing is, we do have a safety net, at least for the rich people, right? When businesses, industries are failing, the government comes in and bails them out.
Yeah.
Actually, during the pandemic, those first couple of relief bills, there were measures stuck into those bills that benefited only 1%ers. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars to help major companies and their shareholders, and also partners in things like hedge funds and venture capital firms. And actually, when you look at the tax code, everything is set up to benefit people who own businesses and people who are sitting on piles of capital, investors. It's astounding to me that we spend so much to support capital gains over labor. I mean, that is a cost to our society. That means if you have you're an investor with a big pot of money pre-existing, maybe you inherited it, maybe you made it, and you invest that money in the markets, you pay a much lower tax rate when you sell those investments than if you had just been working hard and getting a paycheck. I mean, substantially is 20% the maximum capital gains tax versus 37% is the maximum labor income tax. So, a lot of the proposals that have come up have been ways to equalize that. Actually, Joe Biden wanted to raise the capital gains tax rate up to the labor tax rate, which is absolutely, should be done. If anything, it should be the other way around. We should tax work less than we tax investment. And people say, well, but wait, people will not have any incentive to invest if you do that. I say, nonsense. What are you going to do? You take your cash and shove it under your mattress? People will still build companies and they will still invest.
Plus, if you're investing in the stock market, your money is not going to the company. It goes to the person that sold you the stock. The only money that goes to the company is in the initial public offering.
And one thing that really blows me away is sort of the estate tax and all the ways around it. I mean, we created. Actually, I talked to Gabriel Zuckman, the Berkeley economist, about this. And I asked him, because John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were having this long debate by mail about aristocracy and whether Jefferson thought aristocracy would eventually fade away in America because there was so much land available and we didn't have the old British laws of inheritance. And John Adams said, no way. Like in every society, the money's going to roll up like a snowball and accumulate in families, and you're going to create this aristocracy. And I asked Zuckman what he thought about that. He said, well, what we have now is almost worse than a hereditary aristocracy. We have an economic aristocracy in which you can make these dynasties seem meritocratic, like they deserve it. And yet, for the most part, they're just working the system so that the money keeps passing on to their offspring who haven't done anything to deserve it. They haven't built anything.
Right. And they can afford the lawyers that know how to work the system. They don't even have to know how to do it themselves. They can.
Absolutely. I mean, these big families have what's called a family office, and the family offices are just sort of these conglomerate. It's actually a LLC they create just to manage their own finances, and they hire lawyers, they hire estate planners, they hire accountants, they hire, aircraft experts. And I mean, it depends on the family, depends on what their needs are, but they kind of plan everything. And the patriarch, everything in these families revolves around this patriarch. I mean, we talk about sort of the woes of being in this world. One of them is if you're in this kind of family, you're really tethered to this wealth creator in weird ways. And there's a lot of pressure on you to do something special, right? I have a chapter where I talk to a psychologist who studies sort of the effects of growing up wealthy on children. And in fact, the wealthiest children are as just as much at risk for like substance abuse, antisocial behaviors, low-level criminal patterns than the very poorest, because they are pretty easy to get. You have discretionary cash and have access to drugs and alcohol. They're also self-medicating. That's what they say. That's what the kids say. We're self-medicating because of all the pressures being put on us by our families and our teachers and so forth. There's a lot of like addiction problems and a lot of despair and anxiety and depression in this crowd that we don't hear about because people don't like to talk about it. But it's there. It's a pathology of wealth.
You can see where it's isolating, for example. You can see where everybody wants something. And so that kind of inhibits normal friendships and normal community or those things that
as part of this book, I reached out to as many wealthy people who would talk to me. My cutoff tended to be $30 million and up, because those are the kind of families I was trying to talk to. Yeah, I mean, I talked to a woman named Tracy Gary, who grew up in the 60s in a telecom family with the equivalent of probably hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and they had a yellow Rolls Royce and an airplane, helicopter. They had 7 estates, each with their own household staff, and she essentially was raised by nannies and caregivers and so forth. Her parents were gone half the year, traipsing around to social events and charity functions. And, she was a miserable child. She said she didn't even speak until she was 4 or something like that. And she was being raised by, nannies with a 3rd grade education, who would take her out in their communities. And she sort of saw how the rest of the world was. Meanwhile, she's being chauffeured to a private school in a Rolls Royce. And she was just absolutely unhappy. And it wasn't until when she was 14, her parents sat her down and said, "We're going to give you $1 million." This is 1965, when $1 million was a lot of money.
mm-hmm.
And they said, "We're giving you $1 million. You and your brother each get $1 million, and it'll accumulate until you're 21, and then you have access to it. And we want you to do something with it by the time you're 35." What she did is, after getting out of college, she started getting involved in sort of building women's foundations. So forth. She ended up giving it all away. And now she has sort of become a crusader for doing just the same. She said, "I've never been happier getting rid of all that."
Mm-hmm.
She found a community in her ability to give away all that money. And so now, she advises families and so forth on philanthropy and things like that. But, she says she makes like 140 grand a year. She gives 40 of it away. So, she's still giving away a big chunk of her earnings. She keeps enough to live a decent life, but she said, "I've burned my safety nets." She has nothing now, apart from what she's making.
Yeah.
But she's very happy.
Yeah. But
yeah, I mean, I wanted to say, like, the whole notion of my book was not to wag my finger at the rich, right? There's lots of books about inequality that are just sort of tirades, but I wanted to sort of have people think about how we can be better sort of as a society. And this would involve, not a revolution, not a bloody revolution, but a revolution of the mind, a revolution where the rich pitch in and do their part and be willing to not play that game so much, to give up some of their privilege to like you said, level the playing field, because it desperately needs it. I mean, even Biden in his speech the other day, he said right in the beginning, he said, "Hey, you guys know this isn't fair. This system isn't fair." And he was talking to the wealthy people when he said that. You guys know that, right?
yeah. Well, on the one hand, I think for regular readers reading your book, it's it's interesting to see that they too have problems. They have problems just like we do. But the more important, I think, is reaching the rich, like you say, to get across this point that you're not really going to be satisfied just accumulating, that you really need to help people in some way.
Well, there's a CEO actually who contacted me after reading my book, and he wanted me to come to lunch with him to show me something. And I said, sure. So I went, and he had this spreadsheet. He was showing me how I had a section in the book where I talk about the equity shares in a company. The ownership of a company is often skewed like absurdly towards the small group of owners, and it just is logarithmically reduced as you go down the totem pole. And so the owners are worth 100,000 times what they have 100,000 times the ownership of like the workers. And he said, I didn't think that was fair. So he created this system where every time their firm, which has been doing really well, hits a new benchmark, a greater proportion of the profits go to the workers. So he was influenced to, he didn't have to do this, but he read the book and he said, this is something I can do to kind of make my people whole. So that was encouraging. I got to somebody.
And as you pointed out, just giving away money, if you're rich, doesn't really cut it. You need to actually sacrifice yourself in some way.
Yeah, you got to sacrifice something because, you think about the giving pledge, $50 billion. The giving pledge says, I will give away half plus 1 penny of my money in my lifetime. Well, actually in life and death. And if you have that kind of money, giving away half your money makes no difference in your life. When you, except for the scorecard, perhaps. That's what I often wonder. So what is a guy like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, why would they keep trying to make more money? Why would they care about that? Why would they go out and lobby against increased taxes on the wealthy? It makes no sense. They cannot spend their fortunes if they spend, it would take the rest of their lives to spend their fortunes if they even could. So why do they do it? Well, they do it because it's ego. It's a scorecard. It's a record keeping. Oh, I'm the richest this week.
Mm-hmm.
I have the biggest yacht.
Yeah.
Really becomes
control. It's a control mechanism. Yeah. Well, we've run over our time already. It's been great talking to you. Is there more you'd like to wrap up with?
I hope people are entertained and infuriated and motivated when they read my book. I think they'll be all three. I think it's a fun read and an informative one. And
I'll confirm that it's a fun read.
I didn't want to write a book that was going to be a downer to read. So
yeah. Okay. Well, that's great. And it's great talking to you.
You too.
I've been speaking with Michael Mechanic, who is the author of Jackpot, How the Super Rich Really Live and How Their Wealth Harms Us All. Website is readjackpot.com, where his book can be found, among other places. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this edition of It's Our Money with Ellen Brown. Our thanks to our guests, our sponsor, Public Banking Associates, and to you for listening. Be sure to check out Ellen's latest writings on the economy and the changing world of money by visiting ellenbrown.com. And for more information on public banking, visit publicbankinginstitute.org. For information on how local and state government leaders can obtain professional insight and counsel about public banks from key national experts, visit publicbankingassociates.com. I'm Walt McCree. See you next time on It's Our Money with Ellen Brown.